We are living in the age of the science of small things, of huge effects on humanity from small and unseen things. This is quite new to us as a world, really, as an international community. In the past, war has always been obvious. You see bombs, you see explosions, you hear them, there's fire, you know what earthquakes are, you know what floods are, you can see it all happening. It's visible and it's audible. But now we're living in an age of everything is happening silently and by stealth. So you can harm people by microwave radiation from a distance and nobody sees or knows, not even the person who's experiencing it.
Good. Well, welcome everyone to Sunshine Coast for Safe Technology. This is our second Ask the Expert interview. We've also called these, I think, the What Can We Do series. So we started out a couple of weeks back, as many of you know, with a wonderful interview and presentation from Steve Tonaguzzo from the ECSFR. So Steve gave us a fantastic background on the sort of governance and regulatory and political environment that we use common technology in, all these wireless technologies and phones and wireless devices that we're immersed in these days. So Steve painted us the picture there, and today we're going to move into a discussion of the health and biological effects. So basically answering the very big question of, is microwave radiation a problem? Should we be concerned about it? Why? What are the risks and some of the actual biological effects or mechanisms? I suppose we might touch on those. We'll certainly find out. Just for our listeners and viewers, we are doing this one as a presentation. So Julie's got a whole bunch of slides she's going to talk us through. And then also we will make this available through the audio only link and the podcast app. And I was a little bit remiss before. I overlooked a very basic thing. I didn't introduce my co-host, Mr. Chris Henderson. So, Chris, welcome. And sorry, I forgot to do that. That's terrible.
I'm just watching from above.
Yeah, look, thanks for setting this up too, Chris. I know you've done the background work to get our guests all booked in and give them a good reason why they should give us our time. So on behalf of all of our listeners and members in the group, thank you for your work behind the scenes.
Pleasure.
And we'll co-host this together, so of course feel free to dive in with any questions or comments as we go. And our special guest today is Dr. Julie McCredden. So I'd like to bring Julie on and hear a little bit. First up, Julie, if you wouldn't mind, tell us a bit about your background. What brought you into this field, and what are we likely to hear today?
Thanks, Craig, and hello to everyone at the Sunshine Coast, and thank you, Chris, for organising this and having me on. I'm the president of ORSAA. It's a voluntary, not-for-profit organisation of a collection of scientists and researchers and similar people in similar professional fields who are concerned with the lack of transparency. And we've been trying to collate the evidence and disseminate it now for several years. Just to tell you a little bit about my background, I received a science degree years and years ago. I don't want to say how long ago, really. And my science degree was in maths and psychology. They were my majors, and my minor was in physics. I then went on to do a PhD in cognitive psychology. In particular, cognitive psychology is about reasoning, thinking, memory, really how the mind works with the kind of conscious processes. And I looked at how we could model analogical reasoning and using neural networks, which people might have heard of neural networks because they're now being used in AI systems. And they were then too, actually. We were some of the first people in Australia using neural networks, but we were using them to model the brain, not to rule the world. And then I went on to work in education, and my interest has always been complex reasoning and how to help students to grasp difficult concepts. So I was working at uni, probably started working in this area about 10 years ago, and I started, Wi-Fi came along in a big way back then, and iPads popped onto the scene, and we knew they were going to be a game changer. And I was working to try and help lecturers to uptake new pedagogies, that is, new ways of teaching, but I was using technology as a leverage to try and get them to try something new if they would use the technology. And I was a great believer in the technology. I thought, oh, you know, these iPads are wonderful. You know, you could walk around the classroom, you could put students in groups and get them to walk around the classroom and mark one another and give each other feedback. And I was in some classrooms and I was saying, bring on the Wi-Fi, bring on the Wi-Fi. You know, it's not working in this classroom, getting onto IT. And the problem was that it was being touted as a magic bullet that it was going to make the students happier and smarter. It was going to engage them more, and they'd know more, they'd have resources at their fingertips. But what I saw was that the students weren't getting smarter year after year. What I was seeing was that the students were distracted by their technology, that they were using a cut and paste mentality for assignments. They'd cut something from somewhere and paste it into their assignment without actually reading it or synthesizing it into the rest of it. They weren't able to, they were less able than previous students to construct logical arguments or hold their concentration onto one idea. And this all seemed to be making them more into surface learners, which is what we were trying to break. We were trying to get the students to do deep learning. And the whole idea was to use technology to engage them and get them to think more deeply and more comprehensively about a topic. And they seem to have poor writing skills, poor ability to synthesize evidence, and somewhat poorer complex problem solving because of this shallow learning type of mentality and skipping over the top. And I started thinking, do I actually really believe in what I'm doing? You know, I'm trying to promote this technology, but what's going on? And I started looking into it. And I found that there were effects of Wi-Fi radiation on the brain and the body. And when I first heard about this, I actually didn't believe it, because we'd been told so much that the technology was safe, and it had been promoted so highly in education. And, you know, Apple was whining and dining us, giving us free workshops on how to use the stuff, even with, you know, Lindt chocolates. I thought, this must be good stuff. But when I did look into it and started to find out more, I actually went into shock and more denial, and then anger and confusion, and also just incredulous that all this science exists that shows that Wi-Fi radiation and related radiation is harmful, and we haven't been told about it. Especially in Australia, we haven't been told about it. We live in this she'll be right kind of attitude with everything, which works in lots of cases, but it doesn't work when something is actually going to harm us. So I then put my research skills into actually trying to understand it and to test hypotheses. You know, if this is so, then that should happen. And together, I got together with some other people, some like-minded researchers, scientists, and a radiation specialist, and we formed ORSAA. And our goal was to gather the evidence and weigh it up and ask ourselves, is there anything to this? You know, let's go and put all the papers together. And if we can find it, and once we started to find something, we then said, okay, it's our job now to disseminate these, to let people in education, in medicine and government and communities like this one here know. Let them know. And so really my job here today is not so much as an expert, but as a teacher to interpret the science and what I've found out. Mm-hmm. And if you look at the ORSAA database, now it's online and it's free. I'll just put this over here a little bit. We've now got over 3,500 scientific papers. Most of them are since 2012, because 2012 was when the IARC, the international body for looking at whether or not cancer is caused by certain agents, they did their last review on electromagnetic radiation in 2012. So we've gathered the papers since then. And with those, those papers cover all of the main categories that IARC would look at, which is in vivo, in vitro, and that means basically real life in test tubes, and epidemiology studies, which are head counts. You know, people live near towers, or we put animals near towers or masts or cell phones and count how many of them get effects. And we also have papers that look at counts of other papers. They're called meta-analysis, and we have review papers that review a whole lot of other papers. Anyway, out of all of those, we've got about 70% of them that show that there are effects of EMR on human biology, and we also have some plants and animals in there as well. And this table here, which your visual people can see, is a table of showing all of the different categories that we've classified things into in the database. So, for example, it says that we have 34 papers that show auditory dysfunction, hearing loss, or tinnitus. We have 194 papers that show neurobehavioural effects or cognitive effects. We have 15 papers showing cardiac rhythm disruption. So you can see in every category of health that you can think of, there are papers showing effects. Immune system effects, 65. Oxidative stress, which I'll talk about later, 256 papers. Protein levels, protein damage, 381 papers. EE changes in the brain, 112. So you can see there's quite a few papers showing effects. And anybody is welcome to have a look at this database. It's free, and I've got the URL later on, but it's also down there, www.orsaa.org.
Wow. Can I just come in with a bit of what I'm seeing there for our listeners, particularly if you can't see the screen that we're seeing? Correct me if I'm wrong, Julie. This is my summation of what I'm seeing. There's 3,600 peer-reviewed scientific studies showing biological effects.
No, we've got 3,000 in this one. We've got 3,602 papers in the database,
right?
And then we classify them into effects versus no effects.
Ah, of course. Okay.
And then within the effects, we then subclassify those into different types of effects.
Wow.
So what you're seeing here are all the papers that show effects in all of these different categories.
So at the top level, out of those 3,600 scientific papers, over 2/3 show effects.
Yeah, that's right.
Wow. 2,000 papers.
And that's only since, we haven't got all the papers. We have got the military papers since the 1970s in here, and we've got all of Henry Lye's papers. He was one of the classical foundational researchers.
Wow.
So.
Okay. So this body of evidence, I'm imagining, may not be referred to by industry or government. Is that right?
No, that's right. That's right. I don't know if you've heard any of the summaries that are usually wheeled out by various spokespersons for industry and government, but they usually say something like, we have reviewed the literature and we conclude that there are no convincing effects, or there is no substantial evidence, or there is no conclusive evidence. But as you can see, there is conclusive evidence, and you don't have to be a scientist to work out that there are enough papers there to be waving a red flag, to be saying something's going on. And a true scientist doesn't look at those results and say, oh, we don't understand what could cause it, so they're not important.
That's right.
a true scientist would look at them and say, we don't understand what's causing them, so we need to find out. That's what science does.
Mm. So you're a PhD level scientist, and I imagine your colleagues are similarly qualified and experienced. I know you guys, it's very difficult to, you can't pass let's say a poorly designed study past your eyes and get away with it.
No, but unfortunately...
I also come from a science background, quite different though in the commercial realm, in marketing science. So I've designed studies and run them and analysed them, and come to have been in the position to have to come to conclusions from data.
Yes.
And I know just how frail and fragile that position can be, right?
It's very frail and fragile, and you can fool people with statistics. You can design studies so that you get the results that you want to get.
Sampling manipulation, the whole lot.
Everything. And in fact, so the Australian regulatory body for radiation, both ionising and non-ionising, PANSA, have done a review, TRS 164, of the non-ionising radiation literature. Well, they say that they've done a review. However, they took their review from someone else, and that review itself is flawed because they go through and they just cherry pick the papers. And so, well, that's how it seems to us, that they've been cherry picked. But you can see here, if you put them all in and get out this objective report, we're just counting effects versus no effects. There's no cherry picking here. We've got all of the papers both, and we've got all of our PANSA's papers from their database in here as well. But we've just got extras. So, for example, they hardly mentioned oxidative stress. We've got 256 papers showing oxidative stress, which we'll talk about later, but it's a huge thing underlying many conditions.
Which seems a very substantial proportion of all the papers. So if there's 2,000 papers showing effects, more than 10% are oxidative stress.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. So there we go. So as a result of that, I just wanted to mention that we have that evidence, and then all around us, we are surrounded by electrosmog. And I've got a nice picture here of Washington with all the colours showing all of the frequencies going through everything, but a nice little sketch of a student sitting in school, and one child sitting in a classroom. It's not really, there's 30 children sitting in a classroom, and each of them will have a laptop and a mobile phone, emitting and sending to the local router in the classroom, emitting and sending to the local towers or masts, which are usually next to a school, unfortunately. There might be some satellite signals coming into the school or to the mast nearby. And multiply that by 30 times and multiply that by 5 hours a day. That's what they're being exposed to at school. And with that evidence that we were just talking about, this is a great risk for our children. Because if we're going to cover up the evidence or ignore it, then what's going to happen to the next generation?
That is truly a sobering picture. I mean, that it really is. And it reminds me, and also to remind all of us, that really this issue is not about 5G, so to speak. Everyone's so fixated at the moment on 5G, what's coming in the future. We're already in the thick of it. We've already got this situation going on.
Yeah.
30 kids with 2 devices each emitting artificial EMF in every direction.
Yeah. So that's probably the biggest, pointiest end for most people, is what's going to happen to their kids.
Yeah.
And throughout this talk, even though we do mention cancer, what I remind people is that cancer is one thing which is very extreme, and it's terrible when it happens, but it's still quite rare. But all of the other debilitating conditions and diseases that people can get, and autoimmune diseases, depression, all of those things they reduce the capacity of a person to live a full life and to contribute to society. And I implore those who, you know, who only care about industry, even then, if they care about the future of industry, then they'd care about the future of the children, because the children are going to be the ones working. And if they can't get out of bed because they're depressed or too anxious because of what's happening to their brain signals, or if their bodies aren't working properly because they have chronic fatigue or fibromyalgia type things or type 2 diabetes, how can they contribute to society?
Wow. Well, it's a great question. Is that a good segue then to move into what some of these biological effects are?
Well, I thought I'd go through a little bit of an overview, yes, of the physics, because it's usually the first people that you come up against.
Sure.
Do you want to ask me about the engineers, you know, the engineer question?
Oh, yes, the question. Yeah, okay, let me ask that one. Yeah, that was a great one. So we often hear from engineers, electricians, or people who work in the industry, the telecoms industry or around technology. They'll often say that there's nothing to worry about regarding non-ionising radiation. And this is the whole Dr. Carl line that came out last year.
Yeah.
It's only ionising radiation that poses a problem to humans. We've even heard it said or claimed that sunbaking is more harmful than 5G, because when you just consider power density or electron volts or whatever it is, you know, it's many orders of magnitude higher from sunlight than it is from a Wi-Fi router or a cell phone tower. And if it was that simple, well, great. But could you explain the difference for us and what we should understand that perhaps the industry isn't telling us?
Okay, Craig. Now look, this answer might get a bit complicated, and if it does, can you pull me back a bit? Okay, I'm going to try, because I've tried to create a response that the Dr. Carls of this world could hear and understand, as well as lay people and the people in industry, because it is quite often I've heard the same thing, industry and engineers, they're fixated on heating, and they're fixated on believing that only non-ionising radiation causes problems. And first of all, I just want to make it clear that engineers are not scientists, and industry people are not scientists. Engineers take the tools of science and they use them to make things, but they usually are very focused on the black box in front of them, whatever the problem is that they have to solve, and they do a really good job of solving that problem. They're brilliant at it, but they don't look at the whole system. In general, they're not systems thinkers. That's one of the things that we're trying to bring in engineering education, is systems thinking. But if you say system to an engineer when it comes to electromagnetic radiation, they think you're talking about the system of towers and cell phones. They don't understand that you're actually talking about the natural system interacting with the man-made system, and we actually want to look at the whole planetary system. And those people who do say that only heating is the only thing to worry about, or non-ionising radiation doesn't cause effects, I would like to ask them a series of questions. I'd like to ask them, please, can you explain to me how microwaves are created? Do you know? Please, can you explain to me how electromagnetic radiation comes from the sun, and how the particles from the sun form the ionosphere around the Earth? Do you know? Do you know how the electromagnetic radiation from the sun, why the wavelengths that come are important for life on Earth? Do you understand how they interact with plants and why certain frequencies are required for plants to grow? I don't think that they will know the answers to those questions. I think that they will be telling you what they've been told by their bosses and by their industry training, or from one textbook that they read back in their uni years. I don't think that they've really looked into it. And what's blocking them from going any further is a lot of reasons. So I'm going to try and explain a tiny bit of physics here today in as simple as terms as I can, because I'm not a expert physicist. You know, I did physics in my degree, but I'm not a nuclear physicist or anything like that. So I'm going to try and explain it so that people can understand. So
right.
First of all, we have different types of radiation. I'm going to just talk about the radiation that comes from the sun. So what happens in the sun is actually a nuclear fusion reactor. You've got basically a whole lot of hydrogen atoms are all under huge amounts of energy. They're being fused together and reacting with one another and creating larger molecules, helium being the main one. And when they combine and form those larger molecules, energy is released. And that is a quantum level reaction where it's happening right down at the electron and neutron and proton level. And the waves that are released are X-rays and gamma rays. And that's right at the core of the sun. But by the time those waves leave the sun, they're not up in those high frequency X-ray, gamma ray mostly. They're mostly down at the visible light, because it takes many thousand to a million years for the energy to leave from the core of the sun to get outside and then to us. It only takes 8 minutes for it to get the light to get from the sun to us, but to move out from the inside of the sun to the outside takes a long time. Anyway, so when it comes to Earth, what I've got the picture here, the radiation from the sun has actually come to the Earth at many, many different frequencies. It's coming at low frequencies, radio frequencies, intermediate frequencies, which is microwave and infrared, and then visible light, and then really high frequencies, which is ultraviolet, X-rays and gamma rays. Now, frequency means how quickly the wavelengths are moving up and down. So something that has a long wavelength has a low frequency. It's moving, if you can imagine a ball moving up and down on a wave, right? So we talk about frequency. So if the ball's moving up and down really slowly, that's because the wave is really long and slow. But if the ball's moving up and down really fast, like at the shore when a boat comes past, the waves, there's lots of waves coming in one after the other. That's a high frequency. So what we've got is coming to Earth is we've actually got all these frequencies from the sun. And when they're coming to Earth, actually it's mostly visible light and above that we're getting. We get some radio waves, and what we hardly get anything of is the waves that are in the microwave region. So the natural frequencies that come to Earth are not the frequencies that we make man-made radiation from. The frequencies that create life are not the man-made frequencies. When you look at how radiation travels, we're calling it waves, but it's actually packets of energy, and those packets of energy we also call photons. Okay, so it starts to get mind-bending here because the energy is coming in waves. We sometimes see it as waves and sometimes we see it as photons. In opposition are the man-made microwaves. So they're very, very different. They're not created from energy from the sun. They're created in, first of all, they used to be created in analog ways, and now they're created in digital waves. But they're created basically by speeding up electrons and bending their path so that they're moving up and down to create electromagnetic waves. And there's lots of different mechanisms for doing that. You've got the magnetron in the microwave. These days you've usually got some kind of transmitter or coupling device which has got a couple of coils in it to make the waves of different wavelengths and to make the electromagnetic pulse waves go up and down and up and down. So they get transmitted from the towers and then they get received by our mobile phones. And just to explain to people, an electromagnetic wave has actually got two parts to it. It's got an electrical component which goes vertically up and down and up and down and up and down, and it's got a magnetic field part to it which goes horizontally from side to side, side to side to side to side. And that they call it's an electric field and a magnetic field. And what a field means all of the forces are in the same direction and they're all lined up, so that any charges end up being all kind of forced in the same direction and moved in the same direction. And what happens in water's got hydrogen atoms in it, which are positive, and oxygen atoms in it, which are negative. And inside the microwave oven, you've got your food with your water in it. And the electromagnetic field going up and down and up and down and up and down interacts with those water molecules and moves the positive hydrogens up and down and up and down, and the negative oxygen up and down, and that makes the water vibrate, and that's how it heats your water. Okay, so it's actually the vibration of molecules. So you can see that electromagnetic fields can move charges in molecules, and that's the main thing to remember. Okay,
I'm going to make a quick observation there that that water as a molecule, I'm reading a fantastic book at the moment called The Fourth Phase of Water by Gerald Pollack. Wonderful piece of research, and crikey, it's mind-blowing. You just reminded me that very early on he explains how water is the molecule of water is a dipole.
Yes.
It basically behaves like a magnet. You've got a north and south pole on a magnet, or a positive and negative, if you like. And it's the same with a water molecule. So that explains why, if these fields move up and down, then it's the charge attraction causes the dipole of a water molecule to rotate, doesn't it? That makes perfect sense. And then if they're made up of lots and lots of water molecules, these apparently benign microwaves can impact all of our water molecules. Is that right?
Yes, and see, every water is a simple example, but every molecule has a more, most molecules anyway, have a more positive side and a more negative side. And if you start mucking, and it's those positives and negatives that attract molecules to one another and why they combine to make chemical reactions in your body. And if you muck around with where the positives and negatives are inside the molecules, where the charges sit, or how strong they are, then you're actually going to muck around with molecular bonding and chemical reactions. And I'll go on about that in a minute. So, yeah.
The other part, just back a few steps, was that you basically said that life on Earth has evolved in the absence of microwave radiation.
Yes.
Because it's part of the spectrum that doesn't come through the atmosphere from the sun.
We have a tiny, tiny little bit of it, but it's mostly, that's right.
Yeah, wow.
And that's the strange thing, that we've actually chosen the part of the spectrum that we don't know if it, well, we can't say it doesn't promote life, but it's not there. So it doesn't seem to be essential for life. And the question is it harmful to life?
Yeah, right.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Anything there, Chris, you want to add or dive into it all before we move forward?
No, I think that, I mean, I guess a lot of these guys who position themselves as experts need to go back to school.
Right.
I mean, as simple as that, really. It's the public can take a lot from that.
Yeah. A lot of what I'm showing you here, the images I found on the web to show people here, so you can find it on the web. It's just, what does an expert do for you? It just puts, what does a teacher do? They just put all the information together. So that's all I'm doing here. People can go and find this out for themselves. Don't believe me, go and find it out for yourselves. And there's some really, really good books and sites, which we'll talk about at the end. So the electromagnetic spectrum that's coming in, that we're surrounded by, it does have all of these wavelengths. And I've just blown it up here to zoom in on it just a little bit so that people can understand what kind of wavelengths we're talking about. So when we're talking about radio waves, they're at the wavelengths that are about the size of buildings or even mountains, right? So they can be 1,000 meters long. Microwave radiation is much shorter. The wavelengths are at the length of human limbs, all the way up to butterflies and bees in terms of how long they are. So when we think about resonance and how an antenna is something that resonates because it's just at the right wavelength and it conducts to pick up that wave. Well, our human limbs are just at the right wavelength to pick up microwave, low frequency microwaves. And a microwave oven is got the right size in it, so that the wavelength bouncing off the walls backwards and forwards is just the right size to cook a lump of meat, which is the same size as our head, 2.4 gigahertz. So, and 5G is at the wavelength of the length of butterflies and bees in their body length. And when we understand about resonance, how if something starts to vibrate, because it's being a wave is being put through it at the right wavelength that makes it vibrate, then you can vibrate something so violently that you can destroy it, which is what happens with a glass. When a singer sings to a glass, you know, they just sing at the right pitch and the glass shatters. Okay, so it's one consideration is that the resonance effects, we don't know, but it's one consideration that there could be resonance effects of microwave radiation. So I just wanted to zoom in on that, because so people wonder, you know, what's coming into their home, you know, how big are the waves? Well, at the moment they're about, you know, they're traveling at about an arm's length down to a head size. But when the second wave of phase of 5G comes, they'll be down at the size of butterflies and bees.
Right.
So here's the myth that sunbaking is more harmful than 5G. And I've put in or 3G or 4G. So why is that a myth? Because we do know if we go out in the sun, we can feel that the ultraviolet light, it burns our skin. And we know that. But what's actually going on when the light from the sun comes to the earth, first of all, there's a lot of it's reflected and absorbed. And what happens with the reflected waves is they're reflected off particles and clouds. And what that means is that the rays from the sun are coming in and coming to the earth at all different velocities, that they've got all different directions and angles. And overall, they're actually just this random pattern of photons going in lots and lots and lots of different directions. And because of that, even though each photon has energy, there's no overall electromagnetic field, because a field, as I said before, needs everything to line up. Right? So these are actually, they cancel each other out. And that's why they don't cause any electromagnetic field. At a high frequency, though, they're still harmful, and we know because we get warnings for ultraviolet. And ultraviolet is non-ionising, yet it still causes cancer. So any type of doctor that says non-ionising radiation doesn't cause cancer forgot about ultraviolet. But now let's look at...
That's huge.
Yeah.
Isn't it?
Yeah.
Wow.
So we don't actually have, they're not the same types of waves as the ones that we're getting from wireless microwave radiation, which is, as we said, is not found in nature. And what happens is the photons are moving in concert. I'm saying they're actually, you know, moving all together up and down, and they create a strong force field, which is alternating. And moreover, they have two parts to them. They have a signal which is imposed on a carrier wave. So the carrier wave could be like a either a continuous or a pulsed wave. And that's what, when we talk about 3G, 4G, 5G, what we're talking about is the carrier wave. We're talking about how fast is the carrier wave, right? And that's the wave, like the surfboard, right, that's that's coming in. But then on top of that is the message. So we might be wanting to send a text message or a video, and that's another wave with another shape. So here I've got like a picture of a dog, which has got an up and down, high and low and squiggly type of pattern that represents the visual image of a dog. And that's got to get superimposed on top of the carrier wave. So when that when that happens, you've got quite a complex wave going on then. And then not only that, but we then now pulse the waves. So instead of them being continuous like this, we turn them into digital on-off signals. And the reason that's done is because it's easier to make sense of the wave by the receiver, because a 0 or 1 is a very clear decision. Is it on or is it off? Whereas when it's analog with lots and lots of squiggles up and down, you can't really tell, and it's got a lot of more noise in it. So that's a type of wave that is now being sent from microwave devices and to microwave devices. Very, very different from the types of natural radiation that we're exposed to in nature. And the second myth is that only ionising radiation poses a problem for human tissue. Well, if we look at what ionising radiation does, we talked about the energy from the sun before. So the energy is coming in and it's hitting, it's striking, going into the atom and interacting with an electron so that electron gets spat out. It's ejected. And when it's spat out and ejected, it's being spat out and ejected with quite a lot of energy. That's ionising radiation. It strips an electron off a molecule. Non-ionising radiation doesn't do that stripping, okay, because it hasn't got the energy to strip the electron off. Okay, ionising radiation is X-rays and gamma rays. They've got very short wavelength but high energy. Microwaves don't have that energy. They can't strip an electron off, and that's why they're called non-ionising. However, they have a different type of energy that those doctors need to think about, which is when you're talking about ionising radiation, you're always talking about a single photon coming in and acting on a single electron. So just one-to-one type forces in an area. It's only one event happening. But when we're talking about non-ionising radiation, as in electromagnetic radiation from microwaves, we've actually got lots and lots and lots of photons. We've got more than a billion photons, 10 to the 15 to the 20 photons, all in one cubic wavelength, and they're all acting in concert. So can you imagine, instead of one big muscle man coming in and stripping an electron off, what we've got is lots and lots and lots of little average men. We've got millions of them creating a force on the electrons in molecules. And we know that this collective force creates damage to biological tissue because we actually use it to create optical tweezers. And so you can't deny that it exists and that it can create a force. But what it does do is like we said before, it moves the electrons around inside molecules, and it moves the electrons inside. It affects the electrons or the hydrogen atoms inside what we call the electron transport chain in cells. And if people know about the electron transport chain, I'm not a molecular biologist or a cell biologist, so I'm just explaining it from my understanding. The electron transport chain is really, really important in making energy inside the cell, which is what the mitochondria do. And it's called the electron transport chain because it's basically moving. There's a series of molecules that pass a hydrogen ion from one to another, and that chain is required for our cells to use oxygen correctly and to make energy. And if this collective force is actually interfering with that chain of activity, we won't be uptaking oxygen as we need to be, and we won't be creating energy as we need to be. And for those people who got chronic fatigue in the late 1990s, there's a whole lot of people who got chronic fatigue in the late 1990s. And they didn't, at the time, people didn't understand what it was, and they put it down to stress and diet. But one of the reasons could have been that that was when microwave radiation, microwave technologies were first switched on across the world. And what was actually happening was the mitochondria in people's cells was being depleted of oxygen and energy. So that's why people described it as if the plug was being pulled out of them, because it was at the cellular level. If this theory is correct, that's what was going on.
It's fascinating. I know Chris and I have both done a little bit of sort of, we've both been keen mitochondriacs for a little while now. So we've both been studying the function of mitochondria and its importance. And one thing that comes to my mind straight away is that we know that electron transport chain relies heavily on the infrared spectrum of light.
Yes.
And that there's also a role for ultraviolet as well. Interesting that the two ends of the visible spectrum are just outside the visible spectrum at each end.
Yes.
But nowhere have I ever come across anything that says microwave or millimetre wave radiation is essential for electron train transport and mitochondrial function.
No. Yes, and there's a bit of data on heart disease and the prevalence of heart disease. It kind of parallels the rise in use of electromagnetic fields and radiation, with an explanation given that what's actually happening is the mitochondria in our cells are not uptaking the oxygen. And so people are gasping for breath, but it's not actually because they haven't got oxygen in their lungs. It's actually because their body's not metabolizing it in the mitochondria. And similarly, if you put bees in front of microwave radiation, in 10 minutes they stop metabolizing fats and proteins. And it's also one explanation for why people can get type 2 diabetes from exposures, because they're not metabolizing sugars, and the sugars are actually being backed up in the blood. They're not actually, the mitochondria is not able to do the wonderful energy production job and energy burning job that it's supposed to be doing. Yeah. So it's at that level that the explanations are being sought. And there's a lot more to understand. I mean, the part of the problem is that we say we don't understand microwave radiation, how it affects biology. Well, the thing is, we actually don't understand the biology either. That's still at the cutting edge of understanding how the mitochondria itself functions. So it's then even harder asked to understand how non-ionising radiation interacts with it. But the research needs to be done, and it needs to be funded. Given that we've got all the evidence, we can't just say, oh, we don't know, so therefore it doesn't exist.
Yeah, that's a great point, that even if we don't have all the answers, there's enough here that's screaming at us, precaution, 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 isn't it?
Yes.
Like, if nothing else,
yes.
wake up everyone, this is,
Wake up everyone. It's a big ask. So there's the myth that only non-ionising thermal effects cause damage and cancer. And there's a logical fallacy here, but just because something is not ionising, because ionising causes cancer, you can't therefore conclude that if it's not ionising, it doesn't cause cancer. But that's where the wool is being pulled over people's eyes, because people often make that logical fallacy when they're reasoning. Okay, it's a well-known logical fallacy that people make, that if P causes Q, then they think not P creates not Q. Do you understand what I'm saying? Okay, so here it is. So there are many agents that cause cancer that are non-ionising. For example, asbestos, cancer viruses, carcinogenic chemicals, and potentially heavy metals. So there we go. There are things that are non-ionising that do cause cancer. So we could add to that quite justifiably that non-ionising radiation is another agent that could cause cancer. Okay, and you can't claim anything from ionising radiation. The only thing that we can claim from ionising radiation is that it is actually much more complicated than what it was originally thought to be. Originally they thought, oh, the ionising rays come in and they directly damage the DNA as their target. They damage molecules and break them up and annihilate them. But now it's actually understood that that's not the only way that it does damage. It actually does damage to neighbouring cells that haven't been directly attacked, and it does damage to chromosomes several generations down the track. So these are indirect effects, and it's not really understood how that happens, but it's thought that the main mechanism for that is oxidative stress and inflammation, which is the same mechanism that we're talking about for non-ionising radiation. That it's the oxidative stress that is actually doing damage to cells, okay, because of stealing of electrons. So this is what oxidative stress, when you want to think about it, I've put a picture here from the hippocampus, oxidative stress in the hippocampus, because oxidative stress is like rust. If you think of it like rust, that's probably the best way of thinking about it. Okay, and here you can see all the brown bits around the edges of the part of the hippocampus. And what happens is you've got inflammation and you've got an immune system unable to eliminate and repair. And that's what ends up causing the damage to whatever part of the brain or the body. Okay, so here's another, I'm not going to go into this, but I just want to tell people that it's here, they can look it up. There's another mechanism of harm called radical pair mechanism, where you get singlet spins on electrons going to triplet spins, and they are more biologically damaging. This is a really, really old mechanism that's been known for a long time, but we know that non-ionising radiation causes it, and it happens at levels millions of times lower than the ICNIRP limits that we're said are safe. We're told are safe.
Really, I just wanted to, for the people listening, to just come back on there, what you were just speaking to about singlet products and triplet products. I just noticed for the listeners, one of the references you've included is Henshaw 2019, and it says this: cell phone radio waves have insufficient energy to damage DNA and cause serious illness, an enduring fallacy.
Yes.
Interesting.
That's right. That's right. So Henshaw has written it's just a commentary paper, but it's to explain all of these different mechanisms that I'm going through here. He's actually gone through them and said, you know, this is the fallacy and this is the reality. So that's a nice little paper to look at. And this one over here showing singlets and triplets, it actually, this singlet to triplet transition from magnetic and external fields, it's known to be probably the reason it's used by cryptochromes, which is what birds use to migrate. And so this one reason that electromagnetic fields interfere with the bird's migratory abilities. They can get lost because the normal production of this process is actually interfered with, and it doesn't do what it should be doing. I don't know if anyone's ever seen hundreds of birds falling out of the sky. We don't know if that's the reason, but it's a potential explanation.
Wow.
So this is the most well-known mechanism of harm that is talked about mostly because it's such an important mechanism. If it's actually shown to be true, there's a lot of evidence for it, but you know, it's still under investigation. And that's interference with voltage-gated calcium channels. The reason it's so important is calcium is actually used as a signaler a signaling molecule throughout the whole body, throughout neurons, cells. It's so important to everything. How much calcium you got inside and outside the cell. Neurons spend a lot of time, cells spend a lot of time pumping calcium out. Because when you look at the ions, now we're talking about different kind of ions, not ions as in ionizing radiation, but ions are the atoms or molecules that have positive or negative charge on them, that are used to carry charges across cell membranes. And what they do is they actually use for further molecular reactions. But across the cell membrane and across the neuronal membrane, what they do is they create a potential difference. That normally what you have is positive on the outside and negative on the inside, and this positive negative difference is actually created by, for example, potassium, which is positive, going out, and chlorine, which is negative, going in. Okay, so the balance of where the ions are and the way that they are moving determines what the potential difference is, or the voltage difference is, across the membrane. Now, what's happening in the membrane is that the membrane has actually got these protein gates all the way along it. If you imagine, if you just put your hands together and then pull them apart and then put them back together again, that's like the gates opening and closing. And these gates open and close, and when they do, they allow these ions to come in and out of the cell. Now, what happens is that these gates are actually triggered by a change in voltage. Okay, and as we've just described, changes in voltage are happening naturally. It's a natural mechanism for how signals are sent throughout the whole body. When you get a change in voltage across a neuron, you get enough activation that the neuron triggers and then sends a spike of a signal all the way down to the end of the next neuron, and that's how signals are sent throughout the brain and the body. So we want potential differences to happen, and we want voltage gates to be open so that ions move in and out and create that triggering of an electrical spike. But sometimes these voltage gates can be tricked, and one of the things that tricks them into opening is non-ionizing radiation. So once again, because of the electrical force that's being applied by a whole lot of photons acting in concert, there's a voltage, enough of a voltage to trigger the little molecule that's like the gatekeeper that says to the gate, open up. Then what happens is calcium pours into the cell. And when calcium goes into the cell, calcium's positive, that's what creates enough of a change in the voltage, goes from negative on the inside to positive on the inside, that you get an electrical spike and the neuron sends a signal. And so with calcium being calcium's being put into the cell in the wrong way. So because of that, you're getting signaling in the brain and throughout the body that shouldn't be there. And it's also toxic to the cell. So then it starts to create inflammation in the cell. And one of the things these voltage gated channels, these calcium voltage gated channels, are very, very important in terms of everything, all of the signaling that's happening through our body. And it's been recently discovered by a group in Wuhan that some viruses also use these gates to promote themselves. So the same calcium gates that open and close to create healthy signaling that get tricked by non-ionizing radiation also get tricked by viruses. And viruses open those gates to actually help themselves grow and inject themselves into cells. Influenza A is an example of that, but there are others as well.
But in any case, the voltage-gated calcium channel is a pretty well studied phenomena at the moment, and I know it's been a big focus of Martin Paul, and he's often well quoted around our circles.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you're saying there's a lot more to be done.
Yeah, and Panagopoulos, who's more of a physicist who supports Paul's work, he's come to a similar conclusion. And though if you ask our Panzer, they will deny that voltage-gated calcium channels have an effect.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
Isn't that fascinating? And how is it they can get away with denying that when it's just...
Sorry, I was just about to butt in there, Julie. They're not doctors, though, so how can they say that? They're engineers, right?
That's a good point.
Yeah, they have some physicists, and I think it's Andrew Wood, who actually has studied in this area, who says there's nothing to it. So he's saying that from a position of his own expertise, but it's unknown how much he's looked into it. Yeah, and how much, so, but that I know that that's pretty much his position. If you listen to the Science and Wireless Workshop presentation that he gives, that's his position on this. But there seems to be, once again, there's so much evidence pointing to it that it needs to be researched. It needs to be explored and understood with proper funding to do the research. We can't know if we don't look. Yeah. So that's the voltage gating. So I just wanted to explain oxidative stress for everyone who hear that term bandied around a bit. Just in simple terms, it's easy to understand an oxidative agent is like a thief that steals electrons. Okay, and it's there actually, the immune system, when you first get some kind of inflammation or damage, the immune system sends the oxidative agent to go and mop up the problem, and it mops up molecules that have spare electrons. Okay, the problem is that in the long term, that if it keeps going, because you keep getting exposed, you keep getting damaged, that thief becomes a bully. And one of those, for example, is superoxide. Okay, and superoxide likes to go and steal lots of electrons. And to fix the problem, our body sends antioxidants. That's why they're called antioxidants, because they're going to disarm the oxidative agents, the antioxidants. Okay, so that's things like vitamin C, vitamin E, glutathione, melatonin, lots of different antioxidants. The problem is if your body doesn't have enough antioxidants because you're constantly being stressed and you're using them up, or you're already ill from some other condition that you're using the vitamin C for or the glutathione. You might have a dodgy liver, or you might have asthma, or whatever it is. Your body's using up antioxidants, or you might just have a lot of stress in your life. Then you don't have enough to disarm the oxidative agents. And then so these keep going around stealing electrons. And electrons are actually really important. When you look at the people who know alternative medicine and nutritional medicine, people aim for having an alkaline system. And an alkaline system is more negatively charged. An acidic system is more positively charged. So you don't want to have lots of oxidative agents around. It makes your system more acidic. And it's now known that oxidative stress underlies major conditions: depression, mental illness, autism, Alzheimer's, and just general inflammation in the brain. So you can see the flow then from non-ionising radiation causing oxidative stress through several mechanisms that we've talked about, then going on to be an underlying factor between some of the major conditions that we're facing in our communities today.
We had some other questions. One was, I think we all know, we can all observe that childhood rates of chronic illness are much, much higher than they used to be even a few decades ago. And the question was, how much of that increase do you think can be attributed to increased exposure to artificial EMR?
As far as children goes, we don't know, because the research hasn't been done directly about the effects of NIR, non-ionising radiation on children. However, there are some concerning statistics.
Okay.
The first one is that this report came out from the US, the Blue Cross Shield Health Report last year, just looking at the health of America. And they were looking at, when does the major decline in health begin? And it's surprising because it actually now begins at age 27. It's such a young age for the decline in health to begin. It wouldn't be what our parents or their parents would have expected in terms of when their health was declining. And the decline isn't in terms of terrible diseases, it's actually in the chronic conditions. So just in the last few years, since the last time they did the report, they've seen a 20-30% increase in major depression, type 2 diabetes and behavioural health problems, and a greater 20% more for women in depression, diabetes and other endocrine, that's hormonal issues. So something's going on, and this is only 4 years later from when they did the one before. So it's hard to understand what has happened, what has changed so drastically in our society. Those who care about environmental health, environmental toxins, we would say, you know, chemical toxins, things that compromise the gut biome, and electromagnetic fields are the three main causes. But we don't know. We do have some, research on children, epidemiology studies. There's the database has got, the ORSAA database has got about 20 papers. So for example, there's a Danish study on 13,000 children that linked mothers' mobile phone use, both while they were pregnant and afterwards, to emotional and hyperactive problems in children. And the more mothers used the phones during pregnancy, the more problems the children's had. Okay, and then to follow up on that, a Yale study looked at pregnant mice to look at mobile phone radiation, and they looked at the children, and the mice looked fine on the outside, didn't have any physical deformities, but their brains had abnormal structure and abnormal functions, and they displayed behaviours similar to ADHD. There's been a Spanish study showing that young boys who live near radio frequency transmitters have reduced verbal expression and comprehension, and they had more obsessive compulsive and post-traumatic stress disorder. Behavioural pathology, smartphone addiction has been related to electromagnetic signals, not just to the phone use, which can result in phone addiction, but due to the signal itself, because there are fMRI brain changes. So they're just a few of the studies that show that there's something going on with brains. And I'm very concerned about the brain because that's my particular area of interest. And in particular, there's quite a bit of evidence pointing to damage to the hippocampus. Now, the hippocampus is that tiny little bit that looks a bit like a seahorse down the side. We've got one on either side of our brain, down near our ear. And it's really important for working memory, which is your thinking memory, and also for transferring short-term memory. So what you're being told now, what we're talking about now, it goes into long-term memory, and the hippocampus does that work. And it's also where new stem cells get generated. So it's a very, very important part of the brain. And when it's damaged, it's been shown to underlie Alzheimer's, depression, bipolar disorder, and an inability to create memory. These are all things that are important to the developing brain. And when we think about the exposures that we talked about before that children are being subject to at school and at home, it's a concern. It's a real concern. There's been a lot of studies that of course we haven't done them with children, but we've done them with rats. And so learning and spatial memory studies with rats have shown, and they have been generalised to humans. So in this study, for example, there are 108 rats. They exposed them to 900 megahertz, which is the low 4G frequencies. They had a control group, and then they had groups where they exposed them for 14 days, and then where they exposed them for 28 days. And it was that group where the spatial memory was significantly impaired. The way they test that with rats is they teach them how to run a water maze. They put them in this tank, and they have to work out how to get from where they're put in to a platform. And once they get to the platform, they can get out. And so they learn it's a spatial task. But these rats that have been exposed after 28 days, they couldn't find their way out of the tank. And the study said, okay, it looks like it's blood-brain barrier damage. And surprise, surprise, oxidative stress was blamed for the impaired spatial memory. Now, spatial memory is important to all of us because we need to find our way around the world. But it's also even of greater importance because spatial memory seems to be attached to most memories. So when you learn something, you don't just learn the fact, you also remember where you learned it, where you were sitting, who was there, what the surroundings were. It somehow is part of the tag for storing that memory and retrieving that memory. And so if you're harming spatial memory, you're harming memory in general. There's another study with rats again, and it actually looked at the hippocampus, and they exposed rats from 1 day, 7 days, all the way up to 6 months. And they found that the higher the exposure, the greater the damage to the hippocampus, in particular the mitochondria. The cells were reduced in number, hemorrhaged, congested, swollen, and disordered. And once again, they said, okay, this is mitochondrial damage. And they found altered levels of neurotransmitters and just damage, which affected learning and memory ability. Okay, and they're saying it's probably due to the hippocampus. And there was a military research overview of all the different types of effects of electromagnetic fields and electromagnetic radiation on humans. And this is what they concluded. This is 2015, so it's 5 years old now, but they said that microwave radiation is the 4th largest source of pollution in the world after air, water, and noise. So they're admitting it, that it's a huge pollutant, and it induces many biological effects. The military's been studying this since the 1970s. And when they study things, they don't muck around. They've got enough finances and resources behind them to do a really good job. And they concluded the brain is the most sensitive target organ for microwave radiation. And that is the place where mitochondrial injury occurs earlier and more severely than in other organs. So this is, as I was saying before, this is happening to this current generation. We haven't stopped it. We haven't slowed it down. We are increasing exposures to our children. And it's their brains that are the greatest target.
Wow. I just want to add, Julie. I mean, I've looked at some military studies myself. I think I looked at some of the mid to late 70s studies, and like you say, all the biological effects were there. And I remember reading a paragraph that hit me square between the eyes. Basically, their conclusion was that their recommendation to government and industry was to not slow down or hinder this rollout of technology because they'll be severely commercially hindered in moving forward with their plans in technology and advancement. So I just gasp because it's all the research there shows the biological effects, and they're saying, look, we've basically traded that away for advancement and
Well, yes, that's
technological
right.
moving forward. Sorry, I don't know it's political, but it's just, I thought.
Well, it's true. It's true. And we'll see the military, they said to the government, it's, you know, it'll affect your commercial industries, but they were more concerned about keeping themselves operating too, because if you put restriction on it, they wouldn't be able to use them. And radar was a huge technology used. And also, but they've continued, even though that's the case, they've continued to do their experiments because they've done so many experiments to show in fine, minute detail how you can harm people with this technology. They may be doing it because they care about human health, but there might be other reasons that they're doing that too, given that they're the military.
Craig and I are connected to an individual who's a quite significant person in the environmental waste management space, has been for a number of decades. And his observation to us were in Australia, particularly, probably with the exception of glyphosate and Roundup, environmental pollution's air and water quality's generally got better, but electromagnetic radiation has gone up exponentially. So we've got this pollution that we could see going this way, the stuff you can't see is going this way. And Craig probably confirmed that.
Yeah, look, I'm just left, I don't know what the word is. I'm almost speechless because I think of the current generation of teenagers and younger ones that will be teenagers, you know, in the next 5-10 years that will want these devices. We've got loads of military research you've just shown. They're fully admitting that microwave radiation is the 4th largest source of pollution. It induces many biological effects, and the brain is the most sensitive target organ for microwave radiation. The mitochondrial injury occurs earlier and more severely than in other organs. So I just think of all those young people that are chronic users of wireless devices like a mobile phone, and they're holding it essentially in front of their chest and their head.
Exactly.
Hours per day, day in, day out.
Exactly.
If this isn't an expose, I don't know what is. It just makes it so bleedingly obvious that all of these young people are an enormous experiment.
They're at great risk, yeah. People say that they're an experiment, but I don't even think they're taking data.
Yeah, nice point.
It's just absolutely reckless. It's reckless in the name of making money, controlling the population. I don't know. I don't understand the full motives. What I do understand is that engineers live in one silo and biologists live in the other, and it's only the biophysicists who know both that can really help us here. But there's a couple of things. We need the will in government to do something, especially in health and education, to do something. And as far as young people goes, we need a young person who can communicate to their own generation. They themselves are going to have to decide. 50% of them we've crossed the 50% line now. They have in the US anyway. They did in 2016. Over 50% of young people have depression or anxiety.
Yeah, it's astounding. Really. Not to mention the other effects beyond RF radiation, microwave radiation. There's effects of light spectrum, blue light spikes from screens and so on and so forth.
Yeah, and addiction and behavioural and attention deficit, not just from the signals, but just from the dopamine spikes that they get from from likes. Yeah. So many different aspects. But there are people who care from every industry. They just need to be heated and brought together. Anyway, I shall continue. So
I guess what you said was there's very good evidence to show concern about increased exposure to EMR. There's good science showing mechanisms that can explain it. but we can't be sure how much of the increase in chronic illness is due to EMR.
Yeah, so that's with children, and then there's this condition of electrohypersensitivity where people maintain that they can actually feel symptoms when they're exposed to devices such as phones, or if they're near towers, or baby monitors, or Fitbits, or modems. I can go on. And they say there's about 1%, or about 3 to 10% of people who are experiencing some kind of symptoms of the world, and that doesn't sound like so much, but when we consider the Indigenous population of Australia is 3%, so about that many people in Australia might be experiencing symptoms, and 1% are extremely sensitive and experiencing disabling symptoms, where they've basically lost their ability to live in society.
I have to say, just to put this in context, as a layperson that got involved in this field a little while back, prior to getting involved in the cause and connecting with people that were concerned and having meetings and meeting more and more people, I would have completely dismissed this.
Yeah.
I would never have seen it in my experience. I've never come across anyone that's talked about it. I've never had an overt sensation of anything like this myself. I had no reference point, and I would have just thought it was all bunk, to be honest.
Yeah.
But the more I've gone down the rabbit hole, the more we've had public meetings, the more the communities come together and shared their concerns, the more people I've met that have explained what it's like for them to be in a body that can sense it. And it blows my mind. It really does. It seems so obvious now. It's all around.
Yeah. Well, a lot of us don't suffer from hay fever, yet we believe that other people do. We believe that other people suffer from many conditions that we can't feel. But because enough people agree that it's true, then we do too. And so it's this catch-22, because the medical profession doesn't recognise it, because doctors are not trained about it, though that's changing slowly.
That's a bit slower, isn't it? But it is recognised overseas, isn't it, in other countries?
Yes, it is. In Sweden, it's recognised as a functional impairment, and people with EHS are given all the rights of people with disabilities.
Right.
See, one of the problems is that because of the condition itself, people with the condition can't go into public places, and so they can't be visible. They're almost like refugees in their own homes, and so they can't go and have rallies in the street because it's too painful for them to do that. They can't go to the doctors and complain to the doctors many, because the doctor's surgery is too harmful, is too painful. So it really is a very binding, debilitating condition that keeps itself secret. What's required is friends and family who care enough, and that's one of the things I can say. Well, look, I'll just talk about what the symptoms are. So people get headaches, but they're not like normal headaches after a hangover, because everyone says, oh, but I get headaches too. Well, if you get headaches and it's not after a hangover, you do ask yourself, why have I got this headache? If it's happening all the time, you don't just ignore it just because it's a normal thing to get a headache. You say to yourself, why have I got this headache? So anyway, these headaches they're prickling sensations. They're feeling like pressure on the head, like people also feel flushed, but they feel like they're wearing a tight headband, like their skin is tight. They also feel lightheadedness. They can't concentrate. They have memory recall issues. And it's all saying that there's a symptom it's saying that something is wrong. And normally if you got symptoms like that, normally you would actually say to yourself, what's going on? Didn't I get enough sleep? Am I stressed? Especially if it's happening day after day, And this is what the journey that people go through. Of course, the very first thing they do is they don't do, is they don't say, oh, it's my mobile phone. That would be the last thing that people would attribute the headaches to. People who are EHS, even though they're accused of being, hypochondriacs who are afraid of technology, that's actually not the case. The majority of people who have EHS, first of all, were enjoying technology. They felt symptoms, and then they started to go looking for the causes of those symptoms. And they tried everything. They tried diet, and they tried sleep, and they tried stress, and lots of things. They saw lots and lots of doctors, went to lots of specialists, spent lots of money on supplements, and they still had their symptoms. And then finally, they come across it on the net, or a friend or a relative or a friend of a friend, and they find that electromagnetic fields can cause these symptoms, in particular headaches. But it could be insomnia, it could be tinnitus, just exhaustion, cognitive problems. There's also pain in the bones or joints or the eyes, chest pain, nosebleeds often happen with smart meters. And when they find out what it is, they go into shock. They go into disbelief and denial, and but then they keep looking and they find out more and more. They go through an anger stage, and then they start to understand their condition, and they finally get to acceptance. And that journey that most people go on has actually been documented in the literature. A French researcher called Dieudonne he's looked at over 50 people now, just following their journeys, and that's exactly the type of journey. They all go on the same kind of journey, and it usually starts with denial. So people don't want to believe that their devices are harming them because they're convenient, really, really convenient. So then,
in some cases, it's actually a source of income. Like, I must say, I've heard very compelling and detailed EHS descriptions from RF engineers and people that either work or formerly worked in the technology environment or in professions that use a lot of it.
Yeah, people lose their jobs.
Yeah.
People lose their jobs. Yeah, I know one fellow used to work, for a telecom industry. Frank Clegg is the big, ex CEO of Microsoft in Canada. There are people who really have to move out of the industry itself, but there's a lot of people in education. Marie-Therese Gibson used to be the headmaster of Tangara Girls' School, just north of Sydney. And Jim McGahn, who was a professor of astrophysics at Sydney University. They're the most famous ones that you'll read about in the newspaper in Australia.
Then, Julie, you also get Dr. McDonald, don't you, the CSIRO doctor?
Yeah.
He famously won the case against CSIRO for being exposed in the workplace. So, yeah, these things are becoming more well known by the public. Well, we're trying to make them known, obviously.
Yeah, that's right. So what happens is that when people finally find out about it, though, then they try to explain it to their friends and families. And their friends and families haven't been on the same journey. Some of them might have been. Friends and families, close friends and families have been on the journey with them. But others haven't, and they're still back at disbelief. Like you said, Craig, it's bunkum. And they think that their family member has gone mad. And unfortunately, they can do some terrible things to the person who's suffering. They can not just disbelieve them, which is hard enough because the person is suffering all sorts of pain and disturbances in their body. They need people around them to believe them. But their family, if their family doesn't believe them, what does that mean? It means, one, the families don't disable their devices, so the person is always exposed and in pain. The price they have to pay to be near their family is to be in pain. And if you understand the military, when they experimented with this, they discovered they could use microwave sounds to scatter crowds and disorient people. The pain in the head can be so great that it just makes people want to run away, like a science fiction movie. Yet people have to tolerate that to be near their relatives. And then all their relatives test them. They turn stuff off when they turn stuff on when the person isn't looking, to see if they can actually feel it. And then it's a very hard thing. It's a very socially difficult thing. Or the family tries to cope with it, and the family has no skills, especially if they're aging parents. You know, they're trying to deal with something. All of this physics that I've talked about today and all of these mechanisms, older parents can't cope with all of that. It just distresses them, just the fact that their child, their daughter or their son has this condition that they don't understand and doctors don't understand. And they're left high and dry because there's no medical support, there's no medical direction given to them. And of course they can't get financial help either because it's not recognised as a condition. So people who have it, who do lose their jobs, can't get Centrelink. So it's a very, very difficult condition for people to be suffering. They suffer more than just the condition. They suffer financial loss and they suffer social loss. Some people, their families cut them off. And some people, their families even admit them to psychiatric units involuntarily. So there is a bit of supporting evidence that EHS does exist, and the original work was done by Alan Frey in the 60s and 70s and a bit in the 80s and 90s, and he was looking at sounds. Somebody actually came to him after a conference and said, I can hear microwaves, and instead of dismissing them, he said, can you show me? And they took him to where they were experiencing it, and he could hear it too. And so he put all of his research and resources into trying to understand it, then using very, very good psychophysics, which is psychology combined with physics. Very, very good studies to actually look at what was happening. And he found that, once again, if you had microwaves, very, very weak signals, that people could hear buzzing, clicking, hissing or knocking, that deaf people could hear it. So it wasn't actually the same mechanism of hearing through which the brain was receiving the signal. People could hear it at thousands of feet from the transmitter. He also found that people experienced a sensation like they were severely buffeted of the head, like hit round the head, and pins and needles. And he concluded, you know, he spent decades doing this, and he concluded that humans have a sensory receptive signal for microwaves, system for microwave signals. Doesn't understand what it is, but we've got some kind of system that is actually receiving those signals. He concluded that the headaches from microwaves are real, and he said that people who have EHS are like canaries in the coal mine, and that their bodies are warning of other biological effects. Now there you go, there's a true scientist. Today, industry talks about the Frey effect, and they've reduced it right down to a click. They call it the Frey click. You see, they've reduced all of that research that he did down to, that people could hear a click. And he did so much more than that. And then in it, we have our own Australian researcher, Bruce Hocking. I'll just put you down here. The Chief Medical Officer of Telstra. And he looked at the physiological effects on the nerves of affected people. He did case studies and he published them. And he looked at 40 people, and he found that they had burning and a dull ache, mostly in the temporal, occipital or auricular areas. They had headaches which were different from normal headaches, and these were associated with making a mobile phone call. He found a 34-year-old journalist who had pain associated with mobile phones. He used a provocation study, that is, that they didn't know if it was on or off, and when it was on, they had the symptoms. And he explained them by nerve damage, and especially in the C fibres, if people know what they are. They're pain fibres. And he found another man with a neurological abnormality after prolonged use of mobile phone. He had dysesthesia of the pain in the scalp, slight loss of sensation, abnormalities on perception, and he had issues with his cervical and trigeminal nerves. After publishing these papers and working for Telstra, Hocking was made redundant. But this is published evidence of people who are showing EHS type symptoms. Dr. Belpomme, a French researcher, has managed to create a set of tests that are called biomarkers. They're urine, blood and saliva tests that can be used to diagnose EHS. They're also used to diagnose chronic fatigue syndrome because, as Martin Paul says, and Belpomme would agree, the underlying mechanisms seem to be the same. So, as we said before, in Sweden, EHS gets classified as an functional impairment, but in Australia, the sufferers are blamed and marginalised. And our researchers and our centres are looking to psychological studies, not physiological studies. And so people are being diagnosed as having a psychosomatic condition, and one day it's going to be that people will be prescribed cognitive behaviour therapy, as people with chronic fatigue were for a long time. It's been suggested that electrohypersensitive, one of the underlying mechanisms may be demyelination. Myelin is the protective sheath that covers the nerves, the neurons. And it's actually made up of other neurons, but there's a lot of fat involved. And it seems that because of the degradation of membranes, and membranes are made of lipids and fats, that the actual myelin sheath that protects nerves is actually degrading, and that's causing disruptions in the axons of neurons. So that's one mechanism that could explain at least the headaches. So I'll just talk a little bit about 5G, because I haven't actually spoken about 5G so far. I've talked about really radiation, microwave radiation in general. So there's been little research because it's all new. And so people who come out and claim that it's safe and that it's been tested don't know what they're talking about, because the tests, there's been so few tests done. And there's a lot of anecdotal evidence of people, being harmed by airport scanners, but airport scanners are not the same. They're only brief. And 5G is going to be on your home, on a pole outside your home or in your street 24/7. What we do know is that the shallow penetration is probably going to affect the skin mostly, but there is a possibility in that of permanent tissue damage. And there's components of the skin such as nerves and immune cells and blood vessels and sweat ducts, which act as like tiny little antennas that can all carry the signal further. And so it has further implications than just the surface of the skin. There's been some results to show it affects eyes, heart rate, immune system and DNA. And there's a concern about these types of waves called beryllium precursors, because they occur when you have really, really fast pulses from these really, really short waves. And the moving charges that enter the body become antennas themselves, and then they re-radiate waves deeper into the body. And that could cause great harm deeper in the body. It needs to be experimented and investigated, because re-radiating is not an effect that any other 3G or 4G has had on the body. It will only be 5G. If these beryllium precursors exist and are harmful, then they'll be happening at these frequencies. And it means that the pain that people are experiencing won't stop. It'll just continue on and on in the body. So thank you very much, Craig, and thank you very much, Chris. I'll just finish up with talking about, just showing a few links. People can go to the ORSAA website, www.orsaa.org. The ehtrust.org website in the US has got lots of fantastic videos and fact sheets you can download, very, very well communicated. Firemedical.org in the UK, it's a group of doctors, physicians who are trying to help people to understand about the effects. And that's also a very good resource. You can also go to the EMF portal. You can go to PubMed, of course, and do your own research. And I recommend to anyone that they read the Bioinitiative report, at least the summary at the beginning and the table of all the effects at the end show very clearly what we're not being told. Let us just conclude by saying wireless device usage is not risk-free.
Well, thank you, Julie. A little helper here has had to be pacified with a snack.
It's always a good thing.
I think all the science has made him hungry.
I think we all need to be pacified, and all the listeners all need to be pacified with a snack as well.
I liked your conclusion there. Wireless device usage is not risk-free.
Yeah.
I mean, ultimately, that's the question, isn't it? Why are we doing this conversation? Why should anyone listen to it? All this evidence points to concern, points to biological effects, bad ones, not good ones.
Yeah.
And then the conclusion is what? What do we do? So I guess that's not a simple answer,
No.
other than turn your devices off and go wired if you want to be connected to anyone.
Indeed. Indeed, we're saying you can use technology in a safe way.
True, yeah. So I guess that's a nice segue into our next interview, which will be with Cyril Burke.
Yeah.
And he's a great one to talk to explain where some of the nasty sources of exposure come from and what we can do about them and what we can do to connect in those safer ways in our homes and workplaces.
But I just want to add, Julie, this has been epic because segueing between Cyril, bookending between Cyril and Steve's information, this really highlights the serious nature of this beast and how serious we all need to get around our own personal responsibilities in terms of as individuals and our families. And not obviously we've got to look to the government and still lobby those areas, but we have to treat this seriously on a daily basis. We really do. This is not just about industry. It's not just about standards. It's about how we're interacting with this on a daily basis. Take some responsibility for ourselves based on this science.
Very much. It is very much a self-responsibility thing. And as I say to people, there's no point in protesting a 5G tower if you're still using a cell phone and if you're still letting your kids use their cell phone, because there's a greater exposure to that phone. It's doing much more damage to you than a cell tower in the distance. And everyone needs to use their phone safely. They need to keep location services off and airplane mode on all the time if they've got one at all, unless they're using it. And and you can't be an activist out there until you're an activist in your own home. But sometimes that's the hardest place, isn't it, for people?
Yeah, that's right. And it's taken me, as I said at the start, a year and a half, almost 2 years now, at least a year and a half to implement almost everything I've heard and what we'll hear from Cyril. So I'm not expecting everyone to do that overnight, but there's definite ways of protecting ourselves. So, and knowledge is the key. Once you know, you can act. Without knowledge, you're in the dark. That's
right. Well, we've got this actually presents the world with a very wicked problem. It's as a wicked problem as global warming, because global warming, like this problem, to actually make the changes, it means that industry will suffer. It means that our lifestyles will suffer. It means we have to change the way we go about things, not just individually, but also collectively. And there's a lot of discussions and a lot of debate about how that's going to be. But there's something on the scales here. On the scales with 5G, we have on the one hand driverless cars and instant download of videos for our kids who are already addicted to YouTubes anyway. That's on one side of the scales. And on the other, we have human health. And we have to, as a society, say, well, which one of those matters to us? Where are we going to put our resources?
Exactly, Julie, yeah.
I'm just pondering potentially one last question, which was, you know, as a community and as a bunch of individuals in our region, one of the little projects we've got going on to take action outside of our own homes, you know, once we've taken responsibility for mitigating and eliminating sources that we have direct control over, is how do we educate and support our councillors to make better decisions and stand up for us all? And I think to date, part of the big challenge there has been to get them to see beyond the government and industry narrative that this technology is safe.
Yes.
You know, the stuff they're being fed from Panza, for example.
Yes.
So I'm hoping that, you know, at least all or part of the content we've heard from you today will be heard by them, or some of them. But I'll tell you what, like, I wouldn't want to be one of them. I wouldn't want to be a person in that position, because you're kind of caught between a subset of your ratepayer base that's catching on to this issue and then, you know, the state and federal government above you are telling you something else. So what do you do? Very, very difficult.
What's required is huge community consultation with lots and lots of discussion, facilitated discussion where all voices are heard. At the moment, the voices of industry are the strongest, and of scientists who have ties to industry, and government bodies that have ties to industry, they have the voice. The people who don't have the voice are the affected, the EHS, the parents of kids in schools. They don't have a voice in particular. And so that's really what I would work towards, is finding a way to give people a voice and for the conversation that would support the councillors, because they know that they have support from the community.
Well, just to add to that, I think information has just came in recently that our local council's having some sort of discussion roundtable, possible community interaction live stream around 5G. So a lot of the new councillors have received letters from concerned public, and because they're new, they're you know, they really want to go make a difference. So I believe we could definitely, something could happen at that level.
That's great. That's participatory democracy. That's great.
Oh yeah, what was that? That's interesting. It's rarely experienced. So yeah, keep me posted, Julie.
That's great. All right, guys. Well, thank you very much for that. And off you both go and have a cup of tea and a snack. Okay.
Love your work. I really
okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And if you've given us a whole bunch of links there, haven't you, for people to look up more information?
Yeah.
And they can find you on the ORSAA website.
Do you want me to send you the slides?
Yeah, please do. Yeah.
Okay, I'll do that.
Make those available, maybe as a PDF to anyone that wants to have a look.
Yeah, sure. Okay.
Fantastic.
Thank you, guys. Okay, good afternoon then.
You too.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
And thanks, Chris.
Julie.
See you on the next one.